Before we begin, tell me, do you have any family members who lived through World War II? Have you heard stories that have transformed the way you see your own family? Comment below which city you are watching from, because this story needs to reach those who carry inherited memories, silences, and scars. My name is Evelyn Marlowe. I am 63 years old. I was born and lived almost all my life in Portsmouth, southern England, and today I decided to break a silence that has lasted generations. I have lived 63 years carrying a surname that always seemed heavier than the simple letters that formed it, Marlowe. Growing up in Portsmouth, surrounded by docks, shipyards, and families shaped by generations of military service, I often felt that my father's past was only one silent heartbeat away from our daily lives. Yet he never explained the shadows that occasionally crossed his eyes, nor the moments when his voice faded in the middle of an ordinary sentence. Instead, he pushed those memories inward, somewhere unreachable, and I, as a child, learned not to ask questions when the air around him grew still. My earliest memories of him are strangely gentle. He used to fix my school shoes at the kitchen table, humming softly the same melody every time. But even then I noticed the way he froze whenever the humming stopped. It was as if he suddenly remembered where he had learned that tune, and whatever memory came with it was something he refused to revisit. My mother would quickly change the subject, telling me to bring him tea or asking me to help with her shopping list. It was their unspoken agreement: keep the silence intact. Pretend the past lived somewhere far away. Only as I grew older did I notice the contradictions. My father, a man who avoided crowds, always positioned himself close to exits. He never liked sudden noises, though he never reacted dramatically. Instead, he stiffened slightly, his hands tightening in small, discreet gestures that only someone paying close attention would notice. At family gatherings, he chose seats against the wall, as if he needed clear sight of the entire room. When friends teased him about being overly cautious, he simply smiled and said he preferred a sensible view. It was the kind of comment people laughed at, never realizing that behind it lived something unspoken. I remember an afternoon when I was 14. A school assignment required interviewing someone who had experienced a historical event. Naturally, I thought of him. When I asked if he could tell me about the war, he paused for so long I felt I had made a mistake. Then he simply said, "Choose someone else, Evelyn." Not angrily, not coldly, but with a kind of quiet plea. My teacher later told me she understood that some veterans chose silence as a way to move forward. I wrote about my elderly neighbor instead, and I never brought the topic up again. But the question stayed with me, hidden like a bookmark left in a story no one was allowed to finish. As years passed, my father's silence became the background noise of our household. We navigated around it without intention, the way one walks around furniture in a familiar room. My mother, always calm and steady, kept our family's rhythm predictable. She created routines that kept us grounded. Sunday morning walks along the harbour, weekday dinners at 6:30 sharp, and a rule that the radio should never play too loudly. She never explained the reasons behind these habits, but I understood instinctively that they were designed with my father in mind. Still, there were moments when his past slipped through the cracks, uninvited. Once, when a neighbor's car backfired along the street, I saw him tense before he recovered and continued pruning the roses. Another time, during a fireworks display, he stayed indoors, pretending to organize old papers. He was never frightened, never dramatic, just distant, wrapped in a thoughtful calm that felt heavier than fear. What puzzled me most was the inconsistency between the way he behaved and the way others described him. When acquaintances spoke about him, they called him dependable, resilient, disciplined. They said he had been someone others trusted during difficult times. He never boasted, never shared stories of bravery or hardship, and never portrayed himself as anything more than an ordinary man who fulfilled his duties. The disconnect between how he was seen and how he acted intrigued me, but I lacked the courage to dig deeper. The silence between us had lasted too long. When my mother passed away, that silence deepened. My father grew even more reserved, as if her presence had been the last barrier protecting him from memories he did not want to confront. He spent long hours sitting near the small window in the living room, looking out at the street, though there was rarely anything happening outside. I often wondered what he saw, whether it was the road in front of him or a piece of the past only he could recognize. And yet he never once raised his voice, never pushed anyone away, never carried bitterness. He was gentle in a way that seemed almost contradictory for someone who had lived through a global conflict. There was a kindness to him that made his silence feel less like a wall and more like a private garden, quiet, intentional, and carefully maintained. I respected it, even when I wished he would let me in. The day he died, the world felt abruptly quieter. Not because he spoke often, but because his presence had always filled the spaces between words. After the funeral, I walked back into my childhood home and felt an overwhelming stillness I had never known before. It was in that silence that I noticed the small wooden box at the back of his wardrobe, tucked beneath wool blankets that smelled faintly of cedar. I had never seen it before. The lid was closed, secured with a tiny brass lock, and for a moment I felt as though I had accidentally stepped into the doorway of his hidden life. I did not open it then. I simply held it, feeling the weight of it in my hands, knowing instinctively that inside lay the story he never told. The story of who he had been before he became my father. The story of what he carried alone. And as I stood there in the dim light of his room, I realized that the silence he had built around his past had not been a barrier to keep us away, had been an attempt to protect us from whatever truth waited inside that box. That was the moment I understood. The weight of our surname had always been more than history. It was a responsibility he had carried, and one he had never wanted his family to inherit. I kept the wooden box on my lap for nearly an hour before I found the courage to place it on the dining table. The house felt strangely unfamiliar without my father's quiet presence moving slowly from room to room. Even the ticking of the old clock on the wall sounded louder, as if the building itself sensed that something unspoken was about to emerge. I sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the whisper of the wind against the window. It felt like the house was waiting with me. The box was small, no wider than my two hands placed side by side. Its surface was smooth but worn, the color faded from decades of being tucked away. The brass lock was tarnished, yet still held firmly. I slid my fingers across the top, noticing faint scratches, as if it had been opened and closed so many times before being ultimately hidden. I wondered how long my father had kept it there, beneath blankets and old coats, far from anyone's sight. When I finally lifted the box, I expected a sense of intrusion, but instead I felt something gentler, like I was continuing a conversation that had been paused decades ago. I remembered times when I had seen my father standing quietly near his wardrobe, his hand resting absent-mindedly on the door. At the time, I assumed he was simply thinking. Now, I realized he may have been debating whether to reveal the contents of this box to us. And every time he chose silence, I placed it back on the table and studied it. There were no markings on the outside. No label, no initials, nothing to indicate its purpose. The simplicity of it made the box feel even more significant. It held meaning because he had chosen to hide it, not display it. And that secrecy lingered like a faint scent in the air, mixing with old memories and unasked questions. I hesitated before reaching for the lock. It was small, almost delicate, and I feared it might break if I pulled too hard. But when I tested it gently, it clicked open with surprising ease, as though it had been waiting for the right person to touch it. The sound was soft but final, echoing faintly through my chest. It felt like a beginning. Inside, everything was neatly arranged. My father had always been organized, but the level of care in this box revealed something deeper, a desire to preserve these items exactly as he had left them, untouched and loyal to his memories. On top rested a folded piece of paper yellowed with time. Beneath it were several envelopes bound with a thin string, and below those were small objects wrapped carefully in cloth. I lifted the folded paper first. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what I might discover. The paper was fragile, the edges softened from years of being handled. I unfolded it gently, revealing my father's handwriting. It was a short note, written in steady, clear lines. If you are reading this, then the past has found its way back to you. I kept these items not to hide them, but to protect what remained of my memories. Some truths are difficult, not because they are harmful, but because they are heavy. If you choose to open what I have left, do so with understanding. I trust you. I paused after reading the final sentence. The calmness of his words contrasted sharply with the unease I felt. Yet his handwriting filled me with a strange comfort. It was familiar, the same hand that had written childhood birthday cards and grocery lists. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice reading the words beside me. I placed the note aside and focused on the envelopes tied with string. There were 5 of them, each marked with a year. The earliest dated back to 1942. The latest was from 1945. My father would have been barely 20 years old during that time. I imagined him sitting somewhere far from home writing these letters. It struck me that he had never mentioned writing anything during those years. The envelopes felt like pieces of someone I had never met, a younger version of him, shaped by experiences he chose not to share. I untied the string and held the first envelope. It was heavier than I expected, as if the paper itself had absorbed emotions from the past. When I opened it, I found a collection of small notes written on different days. They described places, people he met, and reflections on moments that shaped him. None of the descriptions were dramatic or sensational. Instead, they captured a quiet, thoughtful perspective, observations of landscapes, conversations with friends, and gentle reflections on uncertainty. Reading them, I realized how much my father had withheld, not out of fear, but out of a desire to protect us from the weight he carried. He chose silence so we could grow without inheriting the burden he had known. Yet his words were calm, reflective, and entirely human. There was no bitterness, no blame. Only careful honesty. As I continued through the envelopes, I noticed a pattern. Each note revealed a little more of his inner world, but none crossed the boundaries of safety he had set for himself. He wrote about challenges, but never described them in alarming detail. He mentioned moments of doubt, but always paired them with hope. It was as if he wanted anyone reading these letters to understand that even in difficult times, he held onto a steady sense of purpose. The last item in the box was wrapped in a small piece of linen. When I unfolded it, I found a simple metal badge with faded engraving. It was light, worn down from years of being carried. I recognized it from old photos, a keepsake he always kept in his coat pocket, though I never knew why. Holding it now, I felt closer to him than ever before. By the time I closed the box, the sun had shifted in the window, casting a softer light over the table. I realized that this box was not meant to reveal dark secrets. It was meant to show the quiet truth of who he had been, a young man shaped by a complex world, trying to live with dignity and care. And now it was my turn to understand the weight he carried, not with fear, but with respect. The next morning, I woke before the sun. The house felt colder than usual, as though it had been waiting through the night for me to continue what I had started. I walked into the dining room, where the wooden box sat exactly as I had left it. The sight of it filled me with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. I poured a cup of tea, sat down, and rested my hand on the lid. For a moment, I simply breathed, letting the quiet of the early hours settle around me. Inside the box, beneath the letters I had already read, lay a single sealed envelope. This one was different, thicker, heavier, and marked not with a date, but with a single word written in my father's careful handwriting. Reflection. The word itself felt deliberate, as if he had chosen it after years of considering what he wanted to say. The seal was intact, a small patch of wax that had darkened with age. I traced its edges with my thumb, noticing how smooth it had become from being handled so many times. I hesitated before opening it, not out of fear, but because I understood that this envelope held something more personal than the notes I had already read. The others were glimpses into his life. This one, I suspected, was something he had written specifically for the future for me, or for anyone who might one day need to understand the thoughts. He had never spoken aloud. I wanted to be certain that I was ready to carry whatever he had left inside. When I finally broke the seal, the wax cracked softly, releasing a faint scent of old paper. The envelope contained several pages, folded neatly. The handwriting on the first page was calm and steady, like every letter he had ever written. I began to read slowly, allowing each sentence to settle before moving on. He began by describing moments of quiet he experienced throughout his life mornings, when he woke before the rest of the household, evenings when the world seemed to pause, and long walks he took along the harbour. He wrote that these were the times when his memories resurfaced, not in overwhelming floods, but in fragments. The sound of voices, the feeling of responsibility, and the awareness that decisions he made had shaped the rest of his life. What struck me most was how gently he spoke about those memories. He never described them in distressing detail. Instead, he wrote about the emotions they carried, the uncertainty, the sense of duty, and the hope that he could make choices that would protect others. His reflections were thoughtful, never dwelling on hardship, but exploring the way experiences had shaped his understanding of courage and patience. As I read on, I realized that the letter was not about recounting events. It was about explaining why he chose silence. He wrote that he believed sharing every detail of his past would place a burden on those he loved. He felt that some stories were better held with care rather than spoken aloud. Not because they were frightening, but because they required context and time that family life did not always allow. He wrote, "I learned that strength is not found only in what we face, but in what we choose to carry with purpose." That sentence stayed with me. It was a reminder that he had lived with intention, not secrecy. His silence had been a form of protection, not avoidance. In another part of the letter, he reflected on the importance of listening. He wrote that he hoped future generations would learn to understand one another's experiences with patience, even when the stories remained incomplete. He believed that compassion did not require full explanations, only willingness to stand beside someone in understanding. Reading those words, I felt as though he was speaking directly to me. I thought of the times I had misinterpreted his quietness as distance. I had assumed that his lack of stories meant he wanted to forget. Now, I realized that he had been trying to shape a peaceful life for us. One where we would not grow up feeling the weight he carried. The final page was shorter than the others. He wrote that he hoped whoever read the letter would trust that his silence had been born from care. He asked that we remember him, not for what he never shared, but for the life he tried to build after his experiences, one filled with kindness, consistency, and thoughtfulness. He signed the letter simply with his initials, A.M. When I finished reading, I placed the pages carefully on the table. The room felt brighter, though the sun had only just begun to rise. I realized how much I had misunderstood over the years. My father had not been hiding pain. He had been choosing peace, both for himself and for us. I folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. I did not seal it. Instead, I set it gently in the box among the other pieces of his past. The box no longer felt like a collection of secrets. It felt like a bridge between who he had been and who he hoped I would become. As I closed the lid, I knew that this envelope, this thoughtful reflection, was the beginning of my journey to understand him fully. The silence that once felt heavy now felt meaningful, carrying the weight of a man who wanted to protect his family in the only way he knew how. For the rest of the day, I carried a quiet sense of awareness with me, as though the letter I had read earlier had settled into my thoughts and reshaped how I understood my father's life. Yet, despite the comfort it offered, there remained a lingering curiosity about the other items in the box. If he had taken such care to preserve his reflections, what else had he believed was important enough to save? I waited until evening before returning to the dining table. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the lamp near the window. I opened the wooden box again, this time with less hesitation. Beneath the envelopes and the folded pages, there was a stack of documents, neatly arranged and held together by a thin ribbon. The paper felt slightly brittle, carrying the distinct texture of older records. Each page seemed to hold a quiet piece of history. The first document was a list of names. No titles, no ranks, just names arranged in a simple column. Some were familiar names my father had mentioned in passing over the years, usually when recounting light-hearted moments from his youth. Others were entirely new to me. He had never spoken of them, yet here they were preserved in print. At the bottom of the page was a brief note in his handwriting. Those who shaped the journey. I turned the page and found a small booklet, handwritten in careful script. It was a collection of personal notes my father had made, describing individuals he had met along the way. Each entry was brief, respectful, and centered not on events but on the character of the person. He wrote about their kindness, their reliability, and their sense of responsibility. There was no dramatic retelling, no depiction of difficult scenes, only thoughtful observations about the people who had influenced him. One entry caught my attention more than the others. It was about someone named Thomas Newbery, a name I had never heard before. My father described him as steady, patient, and deeply thoughtful. He wrote that Thomas had a way of observing the world with calm understanding and had taught him the importance of listening. My father noted how Thomas rarely spoke about his own challenges, but was always willing to support others. Reading this, I wondered how many lessons my father had carried into adulthood, quietly passed down from people I had never met. Another entry described a woman named Margaret Elwell, someone he referred to as a grounding presence. He wrote that she had reminded him to focus on small acts of kindness during times of uncertainty. What struck me most was the gentle tone he used when describing her. It was clear that these people had not simply been acquaintances. They had shaped his outlook in ways he never fully shared aloud. As I continued through the pages, I began to see a pattern. These notes were not about recounting events, but about capturing what he had learned from others. It was as though he wanted to ensure that the value of their influence would not be forgotten, even if the details of their shared experiences went unspoken. In many ways, these individuals became the foundation of the life he built after returning home. Beneath the booklet, I found another envelope, slightly thicker than the rest. It was unmarked, but something about its weight made me pause. When I opened it, I found a collection of small records carefully arranged inside. There were certificates, simple commendations, and letters of acknowledgement. None of them were dramatic or grand. They were quiet recognitions of diligence, cooperation, and responsibility. My father had never displayed them, never mentioned them, and never hinted at their existence. One letter stood out. It was written by someone identified only as Superintendent Lewis, expressing gratitude for my father's reliability and steady presence during moments that required careful judgment. The letter was brief, offering respectful appreciation. There was nothing sensational about it, yet it carried a sense of quiet honor. My father had never seen himself as remarkable, but these documents revealed a man who had earned trust and respect through consistency and integrity. As I read through each page, a subtle warmth grew within me. My father had never introduced himself through accomplishments or recognition. His life had been defined by quiet, axe-fixing shoes at the kitchen table, tending to the garden, and offering steady guidance without drawing attention to himself. Now, seeing these records, I understood that this quiet strength had always been a reflection of the way he had lived from a young age. At the bottom of the envelope was a folded sheet of paper, different from the others. It was thinner, slightly creased from years of careful handling. When I opened it, I realized it was a personal statement he had written for himself. It read, "I choose to measure my life, not by what was difficult, but by what I was able to preserve." I hope that one day those who read this will know that peace is built from steady intentions. The simplicity of the sentence resonated with me. It encapsulated everything I had discovered so far, not just about his experiences, but about the person he had worked every day to become. I placed the papers gently back into the box, ensuring they rested exactly as I had found them. I felt calm, more connected to him than I had been in years. These records did not reveal hidden struggles or dramatic secrets. Instead, they illuminated the depth of his character, built over time through steady, thoughtful choices. As I closed the lid once more, I realized that this chapter of discovery was not only about understanding my father, as past it was about understanding the values he had quietly lived by. And for the first time, I felt ready to follow where the rest of the box would lead. I woke up the next morning with a strange mix of anticipation and hesitation. The memory of the letter I had found still pulsed at the back of my mind as if it carried a rhythm, capable of rearranging every truth I thought I knew about my mother's life during the war. I sat on the edge of my bed for several minutes, letting the morning light settle into the room. The quiet felt heavier than usual, as if the house itself understood that something long hidden had begun to surface. For the first time in years, I felt both younger and older at once, like the past was reaching for me while the present tried to steady my footing. I made myself a cup of tea and carried it to the small wooden table near the window. I needed the familiarity of the routine to keep my thoughts from straying too quickly into speculation. My mother had always been careful with her stories, offering fragments and safe details, but never crossing a line that revealed too much. Growing up, I believed that her silence was simply a part of her personality, a quietness developed out of modesty or reserve. Only now, as I approached this stage of my life, did I realize that silence can be as intentional as any spoken declaration. The letter mentioned a location I had never heard her talk about, a place that did not appear in any of the stories she shared. I reread the name several times that morning, trying to connect it to something familiar. It was handwritten in a steady but urgent script, as though she wanted to ensure the word remained clear even decades later. I wondered what had compelled her to keep it hidden for so long, and why she left it where I could eventually find it. Perhaps she wanted me to know but could not bring herself to explain it while she was alive. Or perhaps she believed I would understand better when I reached an age where memories and consequences felt different. Later that afternoon, I walked into her old room slowly, aware that every object carried its own quiet weight. Nothing in the room had changed since the day I decided to leave it untouched. The air felt still, almost suspended. I opened her wardrobe and looked at the neatly folded clothes that she had worn during the final years of her life. My hands hesitated as I reached for the small box where she kept her personal documents. The box was simple, but the contents inside represented decades of decisions, emotions, and untold stories. Inside the box, I found photographs I had seen before, though now they seemed to hold new meaning. My mother appeared younger in them, still wearing the expression of someone who carried responsibilities larger than anyone her age should have faced. There were a few faces I recognized from the stories she did share, but there were also people I had never seen. One photograph in particular captured my attention. She stood beside a group of individuals wearing uniforms that looked foreign to me. I studied her posture, straight yet tense, as if she were balancing loyalty with caution. Turning the photograph over, I found a date and a short note in her handwriting. The date aligned with the period of her service during the war, but the note was brief enough to feel intentionally vague. I felt a chill not from fear, but from the realization that there were parts of her life I had never considered possible. I sat on the edge of her bed, holding the photograph, trying to imagine the world she lived in during those years. I always knew she was strong, but I had never imagined the extent of the choices she had made under circumstances that demanded resilience beyond simple duty. As I placed the photograph back into the box, I noticed a small envelope stuck between two folders. My breath caught slightly. The envelope was marked only with my name. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, steady and careful. I opened it with a mixture of reverence and apprehension. Inside, I found a short letter written in a tone that felt more vulnerable than anything she had ever spoken aloud. She wrote about moments during the war that had shaped her, moments that required her to protect others, moments where fear and determination intertwined so tightly that they became inseparable. She explained that some truths had felt too heavy to share at the time, not because they were dark, but because they carried a responsibility she did not want to pass on until she believed I was ready. Reading her words, I felt a warmth rise through my chest. There was no confession, no dramatic revelation, only honesty, sincerity, and an unspoken trust that I would understand her reasoning. She ended the letter with a simple request to remember her not only for the life she lived after the war, but also for the strength she carried through it. She wanted me to know that her silence had never been distance. It had been protection. I sat in her room long after finishing the letter. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting a softer light across the floor. I realized that the truth I had been searching for was not a secret about events, but a deeper understanding of who she was. Her life had not been defined by dramatic stories or extraordinary revelations, but by quiet endurance and choices grounded in compassion. I felt grateful not for the answers I had uncovered, but for the insight I gained into her character. As I stood to leave the room, I felt more connected to her than I had in years. The past no longer felt distant. It felt present, alive, and woven into the way I understood my own journey. I spent the next morning pacing slowly around the house, unable to decide what I should do with the discoveries I had made. The letter addressed to me still rested on the table, its edges slightly curled from the hours I had held it the day before. Every time I looked at it, I felt a mixture of gratitude and responsibility, as though my mother's words carried not only memories, but also a quiet request to continue something she never finished explaining. I did not know what that something was, but I felt it pressing gently at the edges of my thoughts. After making tea, I sat in the same chair by the window where I had found comfort so many mornings before. The light outside was soft, and the calm weather made it easier to think without being swept away by emotion. I unfolded the letter again, reading each line slowly. Her handwriting felt steady, almost confident, as if she knew this message would reach me at the exact moment I needed it. She wrote about courage not as a sudden burst, but as a steady practice, built through countless small decisions made under pressure. She wrote about how she had learned to trust her instincts even when the world around her felt uncertain. Those words struck me in a way I had not expected. I realized that much of my life had been shaped by her example, even when I didn't fully understand it. She never spoke about her hardships directly, but her calm presence, her discipline, and her silence had formed a kind of foundation for me. I began to see that the stories she left untold were not meant to shield me from sadness. They were meant to ensure I grew with strength rather than fear. As the morning passed, I found myself drawn again to the small box of documents. Though the previous day had left me emotionally drained, I knew there was more I needed to understand. I opened the box carefully, as if the contents were fragile, though everything inside had physically survived decades without damage. I reached for a folder I hadn't noticed before, tucked underneath the rest. It contained several typed pages, slightly faded but still readable. The pages appeared to be personal notes she had written during the war. They were not official records, but reflections she kept for herself. Reading them felt like stepping directly into her past. She described the environment she lived in, the uncertainty of each day, and the effort she made to maintain her composure. She did not describe any events in dramatic terms. Instead, she emphasized the importance of staying aware of others' needs, listening carefully, and offering support where she could. Her role seemed centered on guidance, comfort, and assisting those who relied on her strength. The way she wrote about the people around her reminded me of the stories she had chosen to share with me while I was growing up. I remembered how she always spoke with respect for others, no matter how challenging their circumstances had been. She never glorified conflict nor exaggerated hardships. She focused on resilience, cooperation, and the understanding that each person carried their own burdens. Reading her personal notes made me appreciate even more the effort she had put into maintaining that perspective. One entry stood out from the rest. She mentioned a moment when she had to make a difficult choice involving someone she trusted deeply. She did not reveal the details, but she described the feeling of standing at a crossroads where both paths carried consequences. What mattered to her, she wrote, was the intention to protect and preserve what she believed was right. Her honesty about the weight of that decision struck me more than any specifics would have. I realized that her silence about certain periods of her life was not avoidance. It was respect for the complexity of choices that had no simple explanations. The more I read, the more I felt a sense of closeness to her that I had not experienced even when she was alive. These documents opened a side of her that existed beyond the boundaries of the stories she had told. Here, she allowed herself vulnerability, doubt, and reflection. I found comfort in knowing that she had struggled with her own uncertainties, just as I did now. As the day grew later, I placed the documents back in the box, organizing them carefully. I realized that these discoveries were not meant to solve a mystery, but to deepen my understanding of who she was. In a way, the puzzle I believed I was solving turned out to be less about uncovering hidden events and more about recognizing her humanity. She lived through extraordinary circumstances, but she wrote about them with a perspective rooted in hope and responsibility, rather than fear. I closed the box and rested my hand on its lid. I felt a calmness settle over me, something that felt like acceptance. I understood now why she had not shared everything. Some experiences are too layered to be expressed simply. Some truths can only be understood when the listener is ready. Perhaps she had known that one day I would need to see her not just as my mother, but as a person who faced more than she revealed. That evening, as I sat by the window again, I watched the light fade slowly. The quiet around me no longer felt heavy. Instead, it felt peaceful, as if I had finally stepped into the rhythm of her memories. I felt grateful for every detail she left behind, every word she chose, and every silence she kept. They formed a story that was less about events and more about character, a story that I now felt ready to carry forward with the care she intended. The next morning, I woke with a feeling I couldn't immediately name. It wasn't confusion, though I still had plenty of unanswered questions. It also wasn't fear, even though the path I was following carried emotional weight. What I felt was something closer to readiness. As if the pieces of my mother's story were quietly aligning, inviting me to take the next step. For the first time in days, I didn't hesitate as I walked toward the small box on the table. I opened it again, not with the cautious hesitation of the previous days, but with a steadiness I hadn't realized I was developing. The documents inside no longer felt like relics of an unreachable past. They felt like a conversation that had been paused for decades and was finally continuing. As I sifted through the pages, I found something I had not noticed before. A folded sheet tucked between two handwritten notes. It was smaller than the others, almost as if she had wanted it to be discovered only after I had taken the time to understand everything else. When I unfolded it, I saw my mother's handwriting, but the tone felt more personal, almost reflective. She wrote about a particular place she visited repeatedly during those years. A location she described as a quiet corner where she could gather her thoughts. She mentioned sitting near a small stone wall, listening to the distant murmurs of activity around her while she grounded herself in stillness. She never mentioned the name of the town, nor did she provide specific details. Instead, she described the feeling of the place: calm, steady, peaceful. It sounded like an inner refuge she built, even during chaos. The more I read, the more I felt as though she were gently guiding me toward an understanding I had not yet reached. She wrote about people who relied on her presence. She never described their roles or the circumstances that brought them together. She focused instead on the importance of listening, of offering reassurance, and of maintaining clarity when those around her felt overwhelmed. She wrote about moments when she felt unsure of herself, yet she continued because she believed that steadiness could make a difference, even in small ways. As I absorbed her words, I felt an unexpected sense of familiarity. My mother had always been the anchor of our family, the one who made difficult days bearable simply by being there. Reading her reflections made me realize that this quality had been cultivated long before I was born. It wasn't coincidence or temperament. It was a choice she made repeatedly, shaped by experiences she kept mostly to herself. Near the end of the page, she wrote something that made me pause. She mentioned that she hoped one day I would understand why she never shared everything openly. She believed that stories carried the weight of the listener's readiness. Some truths, she wrote, were not meant to burden, but to guide. She believed that when the right moment came, I would recognize what mattered most. Not the details she didn't share, but the principles she lived by. I read that line several times, letting its meaning settle. She did not want me to dwell on what she chose not to say. She wanted me to see what she carried quietly throughout her life. Her message wasn't about unfinished stories or hidden events. It was about values she hoped I would carry forward. It was about strength, patience, and the quiet bravery she showed in ways that were not dramatic, but deeply impactful. I placed the small page beside the others and took a long breath. For years, I had sensed that my mother held more within her than she expressed. Now, as I read her thoughts written in her own hand, I felt a closeness I had never experienced before. These pages didn't fill in every gap, and maybe they never would, but they gave me something far more meaningful, an understanding of the person she was beneath her silence. Later in the afternoon, I walked outside to clear my mind. The sky held a soft grey hue, the kind that made the streets look almost reflective. I walked along the familiar path outside my home, listening to the distant sounds of the town. Something about the quiet reminded me of the place she described, the quiet corner where she gathered herself. I imagined her sitting alone, writing these reflections, thinking not only about her present, but about the future she hoped her family would build. As I walked, I thought about the responsibility I felt rising within me. It wasn't a burden. It was an invitation to carry her legacy thoughtfully. I began to see that discovering her past was not about uncovering secrets. but about understanding the depth of her resilience. Her experiences shaped her, yet she never allowed them to overshadow the life she created afterward. Instead, she used them to build a foundation of compassion and steadiness for those around her. By the time I returned home, I felt calmer than I had in days. I sat down at the table again and placed all the documents neatly inside the box. I kept the smaller page separate for a moment longer, reading its final lines once more. She wrote that every generation must choose what to carry forward and what to lay to rest. Her hope, she said, was that I would choose with clarity, guided by understanding, rather than uncertainty. As evening settled in, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't simply uncovering my mother's past. I was learning how to honor it. Her words had given me direction, not confusion. I felt ready to continue, not because I expected new revelations, but because each step brought me closer to appreciating the quiet strength she embodied. And for the first time, I felt certain that I was following the path she hoped I would one day have the courage to walk. I woke before sunrise the next day, not because of restlessness, but because something within me felt quietly alert. Even in the stillness of the early morning, I sensed a shift inside myself. As though my mother's words had opened a door I had spent a lifetime walking past without noticing. I stepped into the kitchen, made tea, and let the soft steam rise around me. For the first time in days, I felt grounded rather than overwhelmed. The small box still sat on the dining table where I had left it the night before. I approached it slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of respect. I lifted the lid and looked at the documents inside, now familiar enough to no longer feel intimidating. Each page held a part of her voice, and even though they didn't reveal every detail of her past, they revealed enough for me to understand who she chose to become afterwards. I sifted through the papers until I found something I hadn't inspected closely yet. A thin envelope without any writing on the outside. I remembered seeing it earlier, but had been too focused on the handwritten notes to pay much attention to it. This time, I opened it carefully. Inside was a small card, the kind given out at gatherings or community events. It had the name of a town printed at the top, one I recognized, but had never visited, and a date from the period she wrote about. There was no message on the card, no explanation, just the name of the place. But it was enough for me to understand that this might have been one of the places she described in her reflections. The quiet area where she gathered herself, the spot she returned to whenever she needed to steady her thoughts. I imagined her standing near that small stone wall she mentioned, looking out at a landscape so different from the life she built later. It struck me how far she had come and how much she had carried with her from those early years. Holding the card, I felt a sudden urge to know more about that place. Not to uncover hidden events, but to understand the environment that shaped her resolve. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this journey wasn't about uncovering secrets or collecting facts. It was about understanding her perspective, her values, and the quiet strength that seemed to guide her choices long after the conflict ended. I placed the card gently on the table and sat down, allowing myself time to reflect. I remembered how she used to sit in this very room, reading the newspaper each morning with a kind of stillness that always impressed me. She never rushed, never let urgency disrupt her sense of calm. Growing up, I thought she was simply patient by nature. Now I understood that this patience was learned, shaped by situations that required her to remain steady for the sake of others. As I continued reading through the notes, I came across a page where she wrote about hope. It wasn't an exaggerated, dramatic declaration. It was a simple reminder she often repeated to herself that hope was not something to wait for, but something to practice. She wrote that even in difficult circumstances, the way people treated each other mattered more than the circumstances themselves. She believed that kindness, stability, and a willingness to listen could hold communities together. I paused at that line, struck by how closely it echoed the values she passed on to me. She had never lectured or imposed ideas, she simply embodied what she believed, and without realizing it, I had carried those ideas throughout my own life. I found myself thinking about how much of her influence had shaped my choices, my interactions, and the way I navigated uncertainty. It was comforting to recognize that her silent lessons had settled deep within me. That afternoon, I decided to step outside for a walk. The air was cool, and the streets were quiet, giving me space to think. As I walked along the familiar sidewalks, I imagined my mother walking in her own quiet town decades earlier, perhaps reflecting on the same things I was reflecting on now. I wondered if she ever imagined that her daughter would follow her footsteps in this way, not through events, but through understanding. The more I walked, the more I felt the weight of uncertainty fading. I was no longer searching for something specific. I was learning, observing, and accepting. My mother's past was part of her, but it did not define her in the ways I once assumed. Her identity was woven from resilience, care, discipline, and a commitment to remain steady even when life demanded more than she felt prepared to handle. When I returned home, the light was beginning to soften. I placed the small card back into the envelope and returned it to the box. I knew I would revisit it, but not out of urgency. Instead, I felt a quiet confidence that understanding would come naturally in its own time. I didn't need to force answers or fill every gap. The journey itself was beginning to feel meaningful enough. As evening settled in, I sat near the window and watched the sky shift into darker shades. The calm around me felt almost familiar, as if I were borrowing a bit of the stillness that had sustained my mother all those years ago. I found comfort in knowing that her words were not instructions, but reflections, pieces of herself, she hoped I would hold when the time was right. And now I finally understood why she waited for me to find them. The following morning began with a quietness that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself had paused to let me gather my thoughts. I sat at the dining table with a cup of tea cooling beside my hands, the small box resting in front of me like a companion I had grown strangely attached to. For days it had been a source of discovery, but that morning it felt like something more. It felt like a bridge between the past and the present, something my mother had carefully prepared with the hope that one day I would be ready for it. I opened the box once again, this time not with the expectation of finding something new, but with a desire to understand what was already there. I lifted each document gently, reading familiar lines and allowing their meaning to settle more deeply. I noticed details I had missed before, not dramatic revelations. Just subtle nuances in her writing that revealed the way she thought. She had a habit of pausing mid-sentence, as though she were carefully choosing each word even in her private reflections. I could almost hear her voice in the rhythm of her sentences. After rereading the notes, I reached for the card from the small town she mentioned. The paper felt slightly smoother than the others, as if it had been handled less frequently. I stared at the name of the place printed at the top, wondering what it looked like now. I imagined narrow streets, quiet houses, and the steady rhythm of daily life unfolding there. I wondered what it had meant to her, not in terms of events, but in terms of emotion. Perhaps it had been the one place that allowed her to remain connected to herself during times of uncertainty. The thought made me realize something important. Each item in this box was not chosen at random. Every page, every folded sheet, every note represented something she valued: perspective, reflection, understanding. She wasn't revealing a secret history so much as offering the pieces of a lesson she hoped I would recognize. I suddenly felt a wave of gratitude, not only for what she had written, but for the intention behind it. She had trusted that I would take the time to interpret her words with care. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the room, remembering moments from my childhood. My mother had always kept our home quiet and orderly, not out of strictness but out of a desire to create a sense of peace. I used to think this was simply her personality. Now I understood that it might have been a conscious choice, shaped by experiences that taught her the value of calm. She had created stability not because life had always given it to her, but because she understood how essential it could be. As I thought about this, another memory surfaced. I remembered a story she once told me when I was young, not about the war, but about her belief in patience. She said that patience allowed people to see clearly what rushed decisions would overlook. At the time, I barely understood what she meant. Yet now, reading her notes and holding her memories in my hands, I realized how often she had lived by that principle. She had taken time to think before speaking, time to listen before responding. It was a trait I had admired without ever fully understanding its origin. I placed the card back into the envelope and returned it to the box. I felt a steady determination rising in me, not driven by urgency, but by a desire to honor the journey she had quietly laid out. I realized I was no longer searching for answers in the traditional sense. Instead, I was gathering pieces of her character, forming a picture of her inner life that I had never been able to see clearly while she was alive. Later in the day, I decided to take a walk outside. The air was cool, and the town felt peaceful in a way that reminded me of the places she had described. I walked slowly, letting my thoughts drift. Everything around me, the steady sound of passing cars, the distant chatter of neighbors, the subtle warmth of sunlight filtering through clouds felt grounded and real. I imagined my mother walking through her own town decades earlier, absorbing the same sort of quiet details. It made me feel closer to her in a way that words could not express. As I continued walking, I realized that what I was experiencing was not just connection, but recognition. I was beginning to understand the way she viewed the world, the way she balanced reflection with responsibility. The more I walked, the more I understood why she had chosen not to share everything directly. She wanted me to discover these insights gradually, in my own time. She trusted that the lessons would mean more once I was ready to receive them. By the time I returned home, I felt a sense of clarity I had not felt before. I sat down again at the table, the box still open beside me, and allowed myself to breathe deeply. The documents no longer felt heavy. They felt purposeful. They reminded me that stories are not always told in full detail. Sometimes they are expressed through the values people leave behind. As evening approached, I looked out the window at the fading light. The quiet inside the house felt comforting rather than lonely. I felt as though I had spent the day walking through my mother's memories, guided by her voice in ways I had never expected. And for the first time, I sensed that I was nearing the point where I would understand not only what she experienced, but why she wanted me to follow this path now. This silent guidance was becoming clearer with each passing day, and I knew Chapter 10 would bring me closer to her intention. I woke before sunrise, long before the house stirred, as if the weight of everything I had discovered insisted on pulling me out of sleep. The quiet felt different that morning, heavier, as though it carried the echoes of every choice I had made since beginning this search. I sat at the edge of my bed and tried to steady myself, knowing the day would force me to confront what I had tried to avoid, the meaning behind my mother's final story, and the truth hidden within the memories she never shared. I walked to the kitchen, letting the faint light guide me. The chair where she used to sit still faced the window, and for a moment it felt as if her presence lingered there, patient and watchful. I made a cup of tea the way she once taught me, more to feel grounded than out of habit. The warmth calmed me, but it also reminded me of the times she would sit quietly, searching for the right words whenever I asked about her life during the war. She had always protected me from details she believed might burden me. But now it was my responsibility to carry the pieces she left behind. When I stepped outside, the cold morning air helped clear my mind. I walked slowly toward the small shed behind the house, the one she had kept locked for decades. After her passing, I finally opened it, expecting only a collection of gardening tools and forgotten boxes. Instead, I found the trunk that changed everything. Even now, the memory of lifting its lid brought a tightness to my chest. Inside were letters, uniforms, and a journal written in her careful handwriting. Each page revealed a version of her I had never known, courageous, conflicted, and determined to protect people she had never met. It was not simply a story of service, but a portrayal of her struggle to remain human while surrounded by uncertainty. I returned to the shed that morning, not to search for anything new, but to reassure myself that what I had uncovered truly belonged to her. I placed my hand on the trunk's lid and stood there for several minutes, feeling the emotional weight settle into clarity. Her experiences were not meant to inspire fear or fascination. They were meant to teach resilience. She had never described herself as a hero, and after reading her words, I understood why. She believed heroism was not something a person claimed. It was something measured quietly in choices no one else witnessed. Back inside the house, I opened her journal again and turned to one of the final entries. She wrote about a night she had rarely mentioned, a night when she helped guide a group of civilians to safety during an unexpected attack. She described the fear around her, but focused mainly on the strength she saw in others. She wrote about the responsibility she felt to remain calm, even when she was unsure of what would happen next. Her account was steady, never sensational, and it showed how deeply she valued the lives of the people near her. Reading her words again, I realized she wanted me to remember not the chaos, but the compassion that persisted despite it. I closed the journal and set it gently on the table. The truth she carried throughout her life was not a secret meant to shock me, but a lesson she hoped I would understand when I became ready. She wanted me to see how ordinary individuals could endure difficult times with dignity, how small acts of care could influence the future in ways they never witnessed. The thought brought a quiet sense of peace to me, as if she were guiding me toward acceptance. Later that morning, I walked to the park she used to visit. The path curved around a pond where she loved to sit and watch the reflections in the water. I sat on the same bench, feeling the stillness settle around me. The world she once knew had changed, but the values she lived by remained relevant. I understood then that telling her story was not about exposing hidden details, but about honoring the strength she carried through every chapter of her life. As I prepared to leave the park, the sun finally rose high enough to warm the air. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of direction. Her legacy was not defined by the hardships she faced, but by the perseverance she demonstrated in each moment of uncertainty. Sharing her story responsibly, with respect and care, became my new purpose. When I returned home, I placed the journal on my desk and began writing my own reflections. I did not attempt to interpret her experiences or compare them to anything beyond their own truth. Instead, I focused on how her choices shaped the person I became. Her journey taught me the importance of empathy, patience, and the courage to face difficult truths without letting them overshadow the light that remains. As I wrote, I realized that completing this final chapter was not an ending but a continuation. My Mother S story would remain a reminder of how resilience can guide a person through moments that seem impossible to overcome. And by sharing it with honesty and respect, I felt closer to her than ever before.